Here we go.
Uh, Hello, everyone. Before we begin the seminar, I just wanted to say a few words at the outset because there is a very heavy shadow cast across a place that means something to some of us here at the News Center. I'm sure, as many of you know, in the cities and streets of Iran right now, millions of people are rising in a revolution of immense proportions, and a lot of blood is being lost each night there. And so in starting the seminar, it deserves to be asked, why are we even bothering to have a course or discussions on something as abstract and speculative as imagining a future library when life and death are unfolding as we speak? And it's because I think this is precisely when we need to engage in radical thought. Revolution is not just some physical explosion or even an ideological event. It is a momentary chance to reimagine the world. It is literally the resetting of a reality to its 0 degree, and it offers the shortest window of a breath to dream something different altogether. And so I hope that in Iran they take this occasion to envision something astonishing and new like never before. And why a library? Because for centuries and millennia, the library has protected those zones of imagination that we care about here at the New Center and also there in Iran. You see, right now in Iran, they're not simply killing poets or philosophers or artists in the alleyways and public squares. They are literally trying to kill poetry, philosophy, and art. And they'll lose, as they always lose, because we come back, if for nothing else but to spite them, with new creative will. But let's not be delusional. We also lose. We lose a lot, though we stand our ground at least. So anyway, I just wanted to share some impressions there and say, uh, let's have some amazing dreams these next 4 weeks together, and let's dedicate them to the Iranians who might actually make some of them a reality. Go ahead, please, Melissa, introduce the seminar.
Thank you, Jason. So welcome everybody to Future Libraries, a seminar at the New Center by Jason Babek Mohaghegh. This seminar theorizes and designs the library of the future, an infinite archive encompassing books that have never been written, might be written, or can never be written. Drawing inspiration from mythological, imaginary, and long lost libraries, participants will explore both the spatial and conceptual architectures that could define the libraries at the edges of knowledge and imagination. The seminar will encourage creative experimentation, inviting participants to imagine new blueprints and catalogues for hypothetical libraries found at the end of time and the boundaries of the universe. Through critical readings and original design exercises, the seminar becomes a laboratory for inventing, narrating, and documenting the possible futures of the library as both the real and imagined institution. Jason Mohaghegh is a philosopher, literary theorist, and professor of comparative literature at Babson College. His work tracks current experimental thought across the so-called East and the West, with particular attention to concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, extremism, mania, disappearance, night, evil, secrecy, and apocalyptic writing. He has published 10 books to date, including two volumes titled Omnicide 1 and 2 on madness, two volumes on night titled Night, a Philosophy of the After Dark, and Night 2, a Philosophy of the Last World, a recent book on evil, and a forthcoming work on secret societies titled A Book of the Unlost. Jason, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I want to dive right in. And for many of you who have been in the game with me before. First of all, it's wonderful seeing all of you. I'm very excited for this and thrilled. It's been 6 months since the last seminar. It's felt like an eternity. So I'm glad to be back in the game with everyone here. Just so you know, I'm going to present just some examples of what we're going to be doing, sort of how the experiment runs over the next half hour to an hour. Then we're going to read a couple of texts together, some very mysterious, intriguing texts. And then I'm going to ask you a question, and that will be our way of engaging. But in weeks 2, 3, and 4, the game runs entirely on your shoulders. So I'm going to give you a prompt, sort of an idea, and for week 2, you'll come back. I don't mind you. I'll even tell you just quickly at the outset. So for next week, you're actually going to, the first step is to design the atmosphere and architecture of your ideal library of the future, right? However you want to imagine it, however bizarre and supernatural you want it to be, um, anything goes. But really, it's just about then uh, sort of designing the architecture, atmosphere, material appearance of the library. Where is it? What does it look like? How is it built? What is it made of? That's it. The week following, you will construct the catalogues of rare books found in your library. And you'll come and you'll present that. These can be kind of informal presentations, but they can be as elaborate and elegant as you want. And these will also be the components of the final assignment that you submit after the class is done. So what you're presenting is the material of what you're writing at the same time. So you'll develop in the next week after obscure and strange typologies of writing and thought, the books that are on the shelves. And then in the final week together, you actually get to play a kind of paranormal psychologist and describe the subjectivities and identities of those readers who arrive at the library, as well as the librarians, the secret orders that form there, and the potential enemies of the library. So you get to do some storytelling there about the different characters who inhabit it. So that's going to be weeks 2, 3, and 4. So I'll just start out, excuse me, with a few things here to share. Let me see if can everyone see this slide? It says future libraries. All right. So I'll read a few quotes. Now, this is interesting because these are not actual quotes. This is my writing, but I don't know why I liked it better in quotes. So I put it there just as a weird formatting move. So anyway, first idea I want to get into is architectonics. So the quote says, if architecture is often about the establishment of place, which is guided by a philosophy of containment, limits, borders, walls, institutions, then architectonics is about restoring space to the open, wandering, escape, chasms. The library at its height was always possessed of the wonderment and enchantment of an expanse, boundlessness, vertigo. Right. So, by the way, this does not describe every library. There have been corrupt libraries, there have been propagandistic libraries, there have been terribly conformist archives, and even libraries used as instruments of oppression. But at the limits of our imagination, the library has always been a war zone of space against place, right? Sort of the opening of territoriality, as well as a sanctuary in certain ways, which we'll describe. But that's the first concept, then, is to think of it as an architectonic gesture, right? Second is that the library is not just a building or a collection, it's also a cosmology. So the quote says, to design the library is to design the universe. It diagrams a microcosmic vision of the macrocosm. As above, so below, the Emerald Tablet says. In this way, the library straddles the nexus between world building and otherworldly building. And this is important to me because otherworldliness is not necessarily transcendence. We literally can see the moon. On some occasions we can see planetary forms and orbs sort of in the sky. They're not transcendent. They're not the hidden or the most distant or sort of supernatural in that regard. But they exist at that fine edge between material reality and phenomenological imagination, just like the child who sees shapes in clouds, right? They're out of touch, but they're not out of reach of our perceptual boundaries. And so what remains for us to do is to fill the void with interpretations, weird meanings, projections, and strange ulterior significances. So that's also what a library is when we speak of it as a cosmology. It's a way of thinking sort of the entire cosmos, but not in a transcendent way, but also, not in a way that mirrors the real. So third is to think of it literally as a technology as well. And here we go back to ancient concepts of technology, not the modern one, which is instrumentalized and about domination and even technology. We see how, especially in our digital and virtual technologies today, the extent to which it unleashes sadistic psychology. The figure of the troll, you see, and the sort of uh, there's something there. But ancient technology was something different. So the quote here says, "The library brings what is most abstract, thought, text, imagination, into the realm of touch, a material object, device, sensory atmosphere. Moreover, libraries by nature are purely immersive and interactive, the two passwords of our technological future." Remember that every technology that's being marketed to us today talks about the immersive technology, interactive technology. The space that was built on that logic is the library. You literally have to go through the catalogues, the shelves, right? And so you sit there all night reading in the hallways. When done right, the book becomes that thing that turns us from a being into a zone. Or as Kafka writes, a book must be an axe for the frozen sea within us. Give that Czechoslovakian genius his credit. Kafka is giving us an entire literary theory here, uh, of textuality. To speak of the book, it's not just a metaphor, that it should feel like an axe hitting a frozen lake or a frozen sea. That's the sensorial and existential uh, conception that he has of what a book should do. And lastly, narratology. So I come from an ancient place of storytelling. And there's a great, actually, at the Abu Dhabi Louvre Museum of all places, um, etched on the wall, the very first quote when you walk in, it says, is an old African proverb that I'd heard before. It says, "When an old man dies, a library burns." And so, by that logic, when a library burns, an entire world dies. And to tell the story of a library is one way to tell the story of the world. So, and by the way, if we think about again the highly sort of interface characteristic of a library, where it's kind of carnivalesque, like a kid in a candy store, because you can choose. There's no linearity necessarily. There's no hierarchy of books necessarily. You show up there and you can try and find any book that you want, like a kid choosing ice cream. Well, then the genre, the appropriate genre of literature to think of the library in its form of storytelling is a choose your own adventure story. Right? So that's where you can continually reorient and redirect and try out multiple destinies that are there. So, having said that, this is my only nod to anything historical or scholarly at the moment here, is that there are mythic libraries. You see, I've written that there. For instance, in Hermeticism, I mentioned the Emerald Tablet above, which is a kind of alchemical and mystical work from the ancient world. In Hermeticism, in Hermetic thought, there was always these legends of a place called the Hall of Records, which was supposed to be a secret library of occult literatures that were located beneath the Sphinx in Giza in Egypt. Um, it's never been found, but there are a million rumors circulating about it. There are libraries that were destroyed in time. So, for instance, the Library of Alexandria, also in Egypt, is an exceptional example of that. Was said to have more books in it collected than any library that has ever existed to this day. Um, Occult and apocryphal libraries. So these are interesting, libraries that house texts like the Book of Enoch, which are right at the borderlands. So the Book of Enoch, Enoch is a prophetic figure in the Old Testament. They have a book written by him. It's not included in the canon of biblical literature, but it's also not totally disavowed or condemned as misleading. Instead, it's kind of suspended in its own sacred adjacent kind of space, right on the outskirts of sacred scripture. You're not condemned if you read the book of Enoch, but it's also not encouraged for instance, by rabbis or the church. Same with the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century, and that have not been included or allowed to revise the Bible that was handed down to us. There's the Codex Gigas, which, if anybody knows about, is this massive medieval tome. I think it's the largest manuscript of the medieval era, and it's rumored to have been written by the devil. There's a huge, huge um, emblem and picture and drawing of the devil because the idea was that there was this monk who, at the limits of his exhaustion, begged the devil for help or begged for help, and the devil allowed him to finish this huge text in one night, and actually finish the last lines, but then etched his own image at the end of it. It's a very strange. It actually exists. You can go on Google the Codex Gigas. You'll see the image of the devil that's there in the middle of it. And then there's the Voynich manuscript that probably many of you have heard of, or maybe not. Really fascinating text written in a cryptography which to this day nobody can decipher. Has a lot of weird imagery too. It's a medieval manuscript, a lot of sort of a plant and vegetal and herbal knowledge. Nobody knows what language it's written in, or it's almost like an alien script to this day. There are secret intelligence libraries, those of classified files, and there are oral libraries, which, for whatever reason, you transmit messages through recitation, through generational inheritance, or there may be revolutionary and criminal reasons why that knowledge is being transmitted only orally through spoken words or whispers. So that's that. But if we now just look at, and this hopefully is the fun part now, we can jump into invented typologies of libraries. So the very first one, because we're going to read later Jorge Luis Borges' Library of Babel, and we're going to just read the first opening passages of it. That's where you get the first example of a library called the totality library. So these are libraries that extend infinitely and then collapse. Their defining trait is immensity. They have exhaustive scope and ambition. The risk is that meaning implodes under excess. An endless library is not a utopia, it is an epistemological nightmare. These libraries contain all possible books and impossible books, all books that have ever been written, have never been written, will ever be written, that could have been written, and that cannot ever be written. All permutations of language, genre, style, and syntax are there, and Borges, in another short story, calls these the books of sand. He has a great short story where a figure encounters an ominous, enigmatic book. He purchases it, and every time he reads a couple of pages, more pages grow. At the end, they pour like granules of sand, and it's a book that never can be finished. And by the way, there is also, it just came to mind, there's a book called by Vilas Matas, Enrique Vilas Matas, called Bartleby and Company, which is interesting because it's a book about unfinished books, essentially, writers who didn't finish their last works. And there are a lot of figures like that that even are kind of dear to us at the News Center. Nietzsche didn't finish his final work, The Will to Power. George Bataille didn't finish his final work. It's called The Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge. But look how savvy Bataille is. He wanted to emulate his mentor Nietzsche, so he intentionally even titled it The Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge, meaning that he wanted to end on a book that he would never finish. Whereas I think Nietzsche just ran out of time and went mad. So this is something you can actually even think that it's a nice idea to have in mind, that there should be a book in mind that you should never write. Right? So anyway, the key principle of the totality library is that the more complete the archive, the less usable it becomes. It is a catastrophe of endlessness, of knowing, thought, and intelligibility. These libraries often require, so and what you end up doing then, and we'll read this in Borges, is you either resort to probabilistic reading, so you try and develop these complex algorithmic reasonings that are, by the way, totally fabricated and constructed and illogical, pretending to be logical. Or you can go through divination rather than research. So you start developing numerologies, sacred geometries of how to navigate an infinite total library. Or you just resort to chance. You throw dice as to whether you should go left or right, whether you should take the third book or the fifth book on the shelf. And that's a totality library. There are negative libraries, libraries defined by absence. The defining trait is what is missing matters more than what is present. The risk is nothing. And I don't mean there's no risk, I mean you risk nothingness. Their shelves may be empty, sealed, or inaccessible. These libraries archive lost books, missing pages, burned text, censored works, titles without content, catalogues of gaps. The key principle is that absence is a form of knowledge. Negative libraries teach readers to read erasure, silence, points of violence in the mind, and epistemic disappearance, which are ideas that have gone missing in time. This is whenever people often mistake that they think that I'm maybe a grand enemy of psychoanalysis, and I'm not. I always say that I'm an enemy who honors and is in awe of psychoanalysis because it is really one of the first methodologies outside of mysticism. That's why I think it's a mystical philosophy, to be honest, that tries to read lapses and absences and voids, what isn't being spoken, what isn't being said, what is being hidden. It's entirely a philosophy of the hidden. That's why it's a mystical philosophy. But if we as thinkers here at the New Center gave ourselves the challenge to say, okay, amidst the politics of knowledge, we know that the knowledge that we have at our fingertips that is accessible now, even though Google presents itself as an oracle, of infinite knowledge and accessibility, we know things are being concealed, things are being obscured, things are being suppressed, things are being lost. And it would be an amazing challenge for us to try and dream up or think of what ideas have been lost in time, what forms of knowledge have been lost um, at any given moment. So, anyway, that's what this library would be dedicated to. Three, there are forbidden and cursed libraries. These are libraries that resist reading. Access is dangerous. Entry is denied to most. These libraries contain texts that are banned, outlawed, stigmatized by power structures, force one to disguise their identity, to go incognito. They can induce madness, amnesia, or obsession. They can erase themselves when read, and they destroy their own readers. In another class that I did at the New Center, we talked about a Japanese poem, which is very famous because it's rumored that if you read it out loud, you'll die. And there are all kinds of history surrounding it. And it's a modern poem. It's a 20th century, really eerie, almost like lullaby, dark lullaby poem about a kid who goes to hell. And if you read all the lines out loud, a supposed very famous filmmaker died reading it out loud. A professor died reading it out loud. So there's a lot of things that's part of a genre, a subgenre of the history of literature as well. Dangerous books, cursed books. So we can imagine those as well. So the key principle here is that rules are unclear or deliberately contradictory. Enlightenment can ruin you. Reading may require sacrifice, smuggling through black markets, initiation, or psychological or physical risk. Should some books remain unread? Is the question of the Forbidden Library. Then we have post-human libraries, libraries that are not meant for humans. The defining trait here is that the reader is no longer human. Human access, if possible, is accidental. These libraries are designed for artificial intelligence, extinct species, alien or collective intelligences, geological or cosmic timescales. Text may be unreadable by laws of human perception and interpretation, encoded in radiation, temperature, gravity, or time, legible only through non-conscious processes. Key principle, are there texts meant only for those who will come after us? Can a book be an inheritance in the aftermath of an extinction risk? And you might think of it this way, in the United States, I know most of you are not from America, and you may be feeling very lucky right now for that. But in the United States, in the most conformist public school teaching, um, there's an interesting exercise that they engage in. Often first grade or second grade teachers will make the class create a time capsule, and you're supposed to go home and find something that you want to put in the time capsule for your later self to open maybe 30, 40 years in the future. But if we extend that logic, and I like this exercise, but I don't like the narcissism of imagining your older self. I'd rather, what if the challenge was go find an object that's meant for an alien race 5,000 years from now to find after the extinction of humanity? That would be an interesting challenge for us to think what kind of object we would include, because what I love about that is that context would be completely irrelevant. Meaning all the sentimentality and narcissism that we invest in objects, in our object worlds, would disappear because the alien doesn't care about your wedding or about your even your child. Right? So none of the objects could be related to your person to a person. They would have to be impersonal, which means we would go back to craft. Would just the exquisite domain of craft, right? The object would have to stand on its own without history or identity or meaning or context. So anyway, that would be that. There are entropic or decaying libraries. You guys know that after the Holocaust in Germany, there have been several Holocaust memorials and museums that are designed to destroy themselves over time. One of them is sinking into the earth. It's almost knife-like, and every year it sinks deeper and deeper in the soil. But there are also melting libraries, museums, and other things like that. So anyway, these are libraries that are designed to fall apart. The defining trait is planned deterioration. These libraries rot, fragment, erase themselves slowly, fray with humidity, heat, or neglect. Key principle is that preservation is not the goal. Decay is part of the architecture. Knowledge faces impermanence. They may include biodegradable books, fading inks, catalogs with expiration dates, shelves that break over time. Labyrinthine libraries, libraries without orientation. Disorientation is the prime mover of knowing. There is no clear entrance, exit, classification logic, movement sequence. The key principle is that paths loop, shelves repeat, rooms contradict maps. One gets lost outside and inside, and there is no mastery. Navigation therefore requires either intuition, luck, which is willed randomness here, or surrender. And again, we'll go to Borges and you'll see that his library is not only a total library, but also a labyrinthine library. Borges adored labyrinths. It was his favorite architectural model, and he designs his library that way. Library of Babel is designed as a labyrinth. And at the end of your life, all you do when you die, the librarians come and take your body and cast it into this endless abyss that's in the middle of the library, and you just free fall through space forever. That's kind of the end of it. Counterfactual libraries, libraries of what never happened. Defining trait here is archiving unrealized realities. They contain books about events that never occurred, histories of failed revolutions, science is based on false premises, philosophies from abandoned timelines. These libraries challenge causality, historical inevitability, and progress narratives. The key principle is to reveal that all events and thoughts exist in a continuum of absolute fragility by which they could have, oh, sorry, by which they could have fallen away into archives of lost possibilities. Nothing ever was supposed to happen. This is this I don't want to get into this rabbit hole, but recently there was a challenge launched by an intellectual challenge launched by a very dear friend of mine, who these days I talk to every day, who you all know very well from the New Center, against an old master, an old teacher, who is also of importance to many people, and also has a strange history with the New Center as well. And it's really interesting when a disciple challenges the master, when a disciple has become a master in their own right or has superseded their master in certain ways. And one of the elements of the challenge that was of interest to me more than anything else was that there is often in many philosophers' works, it's not just Hegel. Hegel's the most flagrant and outright about this, but there is a sensibility that whatever has emerged or materialized in history, meaning whatever has won, somehow deserves to win. Right? So either that's premised on a kind of metaphysical promise or metaphysical belief that it has some fatalistic quality, like it was meant to be that way, or it's based on a hierarchy of knowledge where you just think it deserves to win. You know, if artificial intelligence, for instance, is going to overthrow all races and species and become the prime mover of all realities in the future, we think, well, it's because it deserves to be. At some evolutionary level of consciousness, it is better or higher or more absolute. And I think that's the luxury and privilege of people who live in good parts of the world. I don't think that people who have been slaves or people who have been oppressed hold delusions of grandeur that their era is necessarily the best era in history, or that the structures that control things deserve to control them, because there must be some higher meaning or design or power behind them. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that we have to give stupidity its due in history as well. As important as knowledge is, so is stupidity, and so is randomness and chance. Almost every great uh, singer that you, or actor or actress that you ever listen to an interview tells you about their big break, meaning the day they got lucky. Which means that it's just as likely, in fact, it was stratospherically more likely that they would have remained unlucky, and you never would have heard of them. And so this is a certain mentality to go into. And people who in science fiction write in the alternative history genres, where they think of history as forked roads, that could have taken alternative paths. What if this revolution had done this, or what if this figure had remained in power, or something like that? What if this country had taken over the world? They recognize the absolute frailty of the chain of events, and that the sequence uh, is almost absurdly contingent in certain ways. But at any rate, it's a very delicate approach to knowledge, which I like. Ritual libraries. Libraries as ceremonial spaces. Defining trade, reading is an occult field of action, not a skill. There is no neutrality. Access may require induction gestures, chants and recitation, trances and drugs, bodily discipline through trials, temporal alignment with planetary orbits, and this is an important one, assistance by a guide, sage, shaman, or master. Text may be performative, incomplete without enactment, or dangerous if read silently or out loud. Key principle: meaning emerges only through incarnation. These libraries collapse the distinction between archive and altar, reader and participant. Living libraries, libraries that change themselves. Defining trait: the archive is unstable. The archive is an energetic force. Books rewrite themselves, respond to readers, mutate with each consultation. By the way, this has already been suggested at the most cutting edge contemporaneity of our technology. You guys know what the Aura ring is that's being marketed? Aura rings are like rings that can do sort of biosurveillance of your sleep patterns while you sleep, your heart rate, your heat and cold sort of temperatures, and all of that, fluctuations in the body. And the next step is to become kind of multimodal and to interface this biosurveillance with your consumer selections, right? So, of course, the next step is to say, we've been noticing that you're not sleeping well. You should take this vitamin more. And then you'll start getting recommendations from Amazon or wherever as to what you should be taking. But I want to go a step further into our realm of cultural artifacts. You can imagine that also your Aura ring may interface with your Netflix one night and say, it seems like you're in a sad mood. So here's my suggestion of films that you should watch. And this is a kind of library. This is a digital library, a digital archive of information that's being used. Of course, this is being used for the sake of manipulation, but it's not as organic as a living library that's more like a biosphere. But at any rate, the idea that it would respond to readers or mutate with each consultation. Just to show you guys that I can, on occasion, exist in the real world as well. Do you guys? Here's a practical case study. Some of you may know of the company Barnes and Noble's bookstore. It's a huge conglomerate. So it's interesting how history unfolds, because when I was in New York City in the late 90s and early 2000s, for about 12 years, I lived in New York and I loved New York City. It was one of the greatest cities in the world for underground bookstores, or strange bookstores. And then that got almost annihilated by Barnes and Nobles entirely when this massive confederation. And so it became something I didn't like. But now it's interesting with the move to Amazon and everybody just ordering books online. Now I'm nostalgic for Barnes and Nobles. So you know that. And they did resurrect themselves economically, just so you know. This is very interesting because Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon for many years, the founder of Amazon, he actually used to have his first meetings for Amazon in a Barnes and Noble. He didn't have money for an office space. So he and his wife and his first employee used to meet and plot the destruction of Barnes and Noble in a Barnes and Noble that they would meet in and in the bookstore. But Barnes and Noble almost went bankrupt 3 times because of Amazon, but it didn't. And if you might be curious to know what they did. So the first thing that they did is that they had a CEO who attempted to then convert the space in an emergency situation to like being half coffee shop and cafe, and also to sell things that weren't books. So board games, journals, lots of other sort of objects that you could buy because people weren't buying books anymore from them. And that failed. That bought them some time, but it ultimately failed, and they fired that CEO. And they brought in another CEO. And what has kept Barnes and Noble alive, and now they're opening like 100 new stores in the next year, is that they turned them into libraries. They modeled libraries and the magicality of libraries. So now the books are in the front again, and they're produced in sort of really elegant structures and kind of almost towers of books that people can go up. It inspires curiosity. And here's the best part, they started hiring teachers as their employees. Now, that's a sad commentary because it means that public school teachers are not making enough money in their main employment, that they have to supplement it by working in the bookstore as well. But that's what they've done. They've hired people with expertise. Why? So that they could curate a journey or a kind of individuated experience for the person who comes in, instead of a totally disenchanted relationality where you go and it's just someone who works there and they don't know anything about the books. Now you go in and actually they have an information desk right at the front, which is set up again like a strange magical oracle figure. And that person is the most educated in world literature and in all the genres. That's their responsibility. Behind the scenes, they're actually, I've researched this, they're given instructions that they have to keep up on everything that's in the bookstore. And so you go to them and say, well, I really like, science fiction. And they say, well, what kind of science fiction? Dystopian or technological or this? And there's this author and this author. And people are going back to the bookstore because of that. And that's just simply resurrecting the model of the library. Um, so, at any rate, the key principle of a living library is that the catalog is never final but more vegetal, like vines, forests, viral phenomena. Knowledge here is adaptive, contingent, and hybrid. Terminal libraries, libraries at the end of time. Defining trait is that no future reader is assumed. These libraries exist after humanity, after language, after memory. They may function only as ruins, signals, residues of a no man's land or wasteland. Apocalyptic texts. Here, all books become apocalyptic because they're all symptoms of the end times visions by default. Key principle, no one knows their libraries. Even future archaeologists would misunderstand everything. Is a library still a library if no one can ever read it? Interesting question, perhaps. And then there are other subtypologies. So, um, libraries organized by atmospheric conditions, second here, rather than subjects. Books can only be read during fog, storms, heat waves, eclipses. Those are weather libraries. Certain texts appear only when pressure drops. Nocturnal libraries, libraries that operate exclusively at night, texts unreadable in daylight. By the way, every image up until this point are of actual libraries and bookstores around the world. So these are places, and I don't know if anyone can know or guess the number one country that is investing in radical architecture around bookstores and libraries. We know offhand? Like 80% of them are in China, interestingly, interestingly enough. So anyway, nocturnal libraries, libraries that operate exclusively at night, texts unreadable in daylight, catalogs rearrange themselves between dusk and dawn. Sleep deprivation is part of the method. Amnesiac libraries. Every visit erases the memory of previous visits. Readers never know if they've been there before. Marginalia disappears. Knowledge cannot accumulate. False libraries. Libraries that pretend to contain books but do not. Spines are blank or mislabeled. Catalogs lie. The act of searching becomes the only content. Actually, do you guys know this is a major part of interior decoration now? People buy books that are not actual books. They buy false hollow books that they just put, it looks really good on the shelf, but there's not actually anything in them. Okay, then we go to, oops. Breath-dependent libraries. These shelves require altered breathing patterns, hyperventilation, apnea, rhythmic inhalation. Meaning fluctuates with oxygen levels. Each book contains a smaller, oh, fractal libraries. Each book contains a smaller library. Each library repeats the whole at a different scale. Reading never reaches a foundational text. Parasitic libraries. These are libraries that attach themselves to other institutions, museums, hospitals, prisons, factories, books that burrow deep into the reader's own internal body like a fungal organism. They feed on adjacent forms and rewrite them from within. Real quick here, there's a great contemporary Lebanese architect named Bernard Khoury, who there was a competition for a design for a new art museum in Lebanon, in Beirut. And Beirut, if you don't know, is a historically beautiful but ravaged city, ravaged by bombings and constantly rebuilt in the past 20 years, as well as a civil war, a very bloody civil war that lasted over a decade. And he's emerged in the ashes of Beirut's constant devastation as a very interesting architectural figure. Well, his design for a museum, an art museum, was not a stationary built space, but rather a tunnel system, subterranean tunnel system beneath the streets of Beirut, where you would go down in an elevator and there would be like 27 different tunnels that you could go to. And you'd walk through them and you would surface and emerge in some place in the city where there was a great artwork. And that could be a hotel lobby. You just pop up into a hotel lobby. It could be a university. It could be someone's bedroom or private estate. There were all kinds. It could be a nightclub. And he had found and selected this. It was not chosen, by the way, by the government to know, but the diagrams and the designs are there if you're ever interested in seeing his suggestion. There are prisoners' libraries, libraries whose space is meant to incarcerate and whose texts are punishments. Each book is a sentence rather than a narrative. Reading is a form of penance and condemnation. There are vanishing libraries that exist only temporarily. They appear for minutes, days, or a single generation. Disappearance is scheduled, not accidental. There are orphan libraries. And that's actually, by the way, think about how children really experiment in their literature with countdowns. Think of like Cinderella only having until midnight, right, before she has to go back. And that would be an interesting concept of the library too. You only have, 20 minutes in the library. You only have 3 hours in the library. And that would place a certain urgency and a component of speed to the act of knowing and reading. Orphan libraries, libraries without origin stories, no known founder, no founding myth, their beginning has been deliberately erased. Mirror libraries, libraries that reflect the reader's inner state. The same shelf reads differently each time, there is no shared text. Shadow libraries, libraries that exist only as shadows cast by other libraries. You guys know that there's this quantum physics theory. It's a very remote and obscure one, and it's one that doesn't really have that much scientific verification, obviously, but there's a theory, there's a very speculative theory in quantum physics that we are actually just a reflection, a kind of holographic reflection of another reality, meaning that they're actually living it, but we're the echo or the mirror image of it or the shadow play of it. This would be a similar concept here. So there's no direct access. It's only inferred through absence and distortion. This would be the importance of a shadow library. If you're in a library that is simply the effect of another library, the actual library, this is what would make knowing suddenly be based on paranoia and suspicion. You would follow glitches, blurred spots, malfunctions, above all else. There are grieving libraries, which are libraries devoted entirely to loss. Books cannot be borrowed, only mourned. I can't read what it says there for some reason. Silence is the dominant medium. Hallucinatory libraries, libraries that cannot be verified as real. Different readers report incompatible layouts. By the way, there are histories of this. Um, the architecture shapeshifts between accounts. Unfinished libraries, libraries permanently under construction. Scaffolding replaces shelves. Books exist only as drafts. Index-only libraries, only catalogues exist, no books have ever been found. References refer to each other endlessly in metatextual loops. Erroneous libraries, every text contains at least one critical error. Truth emerges only through cross-contamination. Correction is forbidden. And I think oh no, I got a couple more. Uh, what does the next one say? Biological libraries, texts grow rather than are being written. Books decay, bleed, heal, reproduce. Reading requires care, inhalation, or ingestion rather than comprehension. Temporal loop libraries, libraries readers enter but never leave chronologically. Reading alters the time of entry retroactively. No first visit exists. Listening libraries, those are no written text, only echoes, whispers, repetitions, recordings of lost voices. Silence is indexed. Disobedient libraries that refuse user intent. Search queries are ignored. All the files mislead you. You're sent elsewhere than intended. Apologetic libraries, libraries that apologize for their own existence. Every book begins with an apology. Knowledge is framed as an intrusion. An alternative is also that libraries that are full of books of questions, only having books of questions. And witness libraries, libraries that observe readers rather than the reverse. Text record how they are read. The archive is behavioral, not textual. So that gets into surveillance again. Inheritance libraries, libraries one never chooses. Access is granted only through lineage, accident, or curse. No voluntary readers. One is chosen through bloodline, gift, or destiny. You could think about this, how interesting it would be that you would have access to, and by the way, magical narratives are often this. If you think of even Harry Potter, it's because of bloodline that he's allowed access to this alternative sort of sorcery reality. But oftentimes, much more than bloodline, I don't love histories of blood as much as I like the idea of gifts. So you meet a stranger, sort of thing, and they give you a ticket or they give you some sort of entry pass, a password that allows you to go into it. Untranslatable libraries would be where every text resists translation, meaning collapses when moved across languages, monolingualism is enforced. Exhaustion libraries, which are designed to wear down readers, long corridors, heavy books, impossible chairs. Understanding occurs only through fatigue. After image libraries, libraries that remain visible only after leaving, nothing readable inside, texts appear later involuntarily. And finally, recanted libraries, libraries of retracted books, disowned, disavowed. Do any of you know, by the way, maybe you'll write in the chat, authors who have disowned their own works? So, one, for instance, Burgess, who wrote Clockwork Orange, you may know that as a film by Kubrick. But the writer of Clockwork Orange became a born again Christian, and he completely denounced his young writings because they were full of violence and drug experimentation and things like that. And he made a deal with the publisher that they could only continue to publish it if they also published his preface, his new preface. And his new preface constantly told the reader not to read the book. He's constantly saying, don't read this book that I wrote. It'll mislead you. It'll tempt you into bad things. I don't believe in this book anymore. And so that's an interesting thing, but also Emil Cioran. Cioran is a great East European writer, Romanian writer, phenomenal thinker, friend of Samuel Beckett, brilliant nihilistic thinker. Cioran said famous things like, if it wasn't for the thought of suicide, I would have killed myself a long time ago. He's a really dark thinker, but brilliant figure. He got famous off of a book that he wrote, like Rimbaud. There are figures who write their masterpieces when they're very young. He was 20 years old when he wrote On the Heights of Despair, which is a gorgeous book, really beautiful, and the book that he hated more than any book that he ever wrote. By the time he reached his other masterpiece, A Short History of Decay, which is phenomenal, which he wrote, I believe, in his 50s, he's spitting at On the Heights of Despair constantly in his writing, saying, I wish I never wrote that. I wish I had just kept silent and waited. Everybody knows me from that. I hate that book. So there are figures who have disowned and disavowed their own works. So imagine an entire library full of that. And every text has been withdrawn by its author, authority has been undone. Misplaced libraries. Libraries, oh, by the way, and you all know that Kafka in his Death Note wrote to his best friend to burn all his books, which means all his manuscripts. They were all unpublished. And so even to read Kafka as a trespass is an intrusion against his wishes. Um, Misplaced libraries. Libraries located where they do not belong, deserts, underwater ruins, border zones, abandoned satellites, deterritorialization sabotages context, and libraries that refuse to be named. No title, no signage, no catalog entry. To name them is to lose access. One law, You're not allowed to tell anyone that you've ever been to this library. I have the great fortune, sometimes life is kind to us. I have the great fortune of having been to a library like this, that you're not allowed to name or tell where it is. It's a nice secret to walk with. It's a good test as well. So, at any rate, that's just to give you a whole sort of list of possibilities. And now I would love to read together the opening entries to Borges's Library of Babel, and then I want to hear your notes and your thoughts on what you see here. So if I can just share this, hold on one second. Okay. So first things first, and Liz, if you could kindly, as I can't see everybody, I don't know if you're able to see everyone or not, if someone raises a hand, but because I know on my screen right now I only see four people, and we're two of them, so I'm not seeing a full gallery uh, or grid.
Yeah, no one's raised their hand, but there's been some comments in the
No,
chat
no,
if
I'm
you
saying right now, if you could call out the people who are going to raise their hand. I just like one impression of what you think it means that Borges does something like including, and anybody can answer this, including a supposed quote sort of at the outset from this book, The Anatomy of Melancholy. It's a technique on his part. It's a narrative technique. Go ahead. Does anybody?
who's gonna raise their hand.
It's a classic move by him. He does this all the
No
time.
one's
All right, now I'll just spoil it for you. It's a pseudo nerdy gesture to make it look official and encyclopedic, right? It's to give it a decorative thing of that Borges is a scholar, right? And Borges was the head librarian of Buenos Aires, of the Library of Buenos Aires. But he's imitating, he's wearing the disguise of a very serious and scholarly figure by doing that. He does this all the time. I will tell you, The Anatomy of Melancholy is not an actual book. It's a fabricated book. Part two, section two, verse four, this is all his sort of little detailing to make you think that you're in a stable zone of knowledge, just so that he can then break it in half. He can shatter that delusion, right? Giorgio Agamben, or whatever one thinks of him as a philosopher, if you love him, if you dislike him, doesn't matter. He has a book of aphorisms that are his weirdest book, and he puts numerals by all of them. And that very small gesture of enumeration makes them seem as if it's legitimate, scientific, precise. It's the weirdest thing he's written. It doesn't make any sense. But that's precisely kind of a nice counterbalance. So this is what Borges does to make you drop your guard and think that, oh, I'm in the realm of history, of knowledge. And then he begins. The universe, which others call the library, is composed, and there you see where even at the outset I said to design the library is to design the universe. Comes from Borges. The universe, which others call the library, is composed of an indefinite and perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries, with vast air shafts between, surrounded by very low railings. From any of the hexagons, one can see interminably the upper and lower floors. The distribution of the galleries is invariable. 20 shelves, five long shelves per side, cover all the sides except two. Their height, which is the distance from floor to ceiling, scarcely exceeds that of a normal bookcase. Okay, so first of all, just like we described of how we're going to go about this, how does Borges begin the description of the library? Go ahead, Peggy.
by maybe, oh, sorry. Yeah, go
Or
ahead.
or
Oh,
yeah,
go
Peggy,
ahead.
go ahead.
with architecture, and the hexagon shape is going to sort of make me think of a hive or some sort of structure like that, although it's got an up and down to it. So,
Exactly. Excellent. So this is the first thing is that we want to take his cue that why would an amazing reader like Borges not start with a textual sort of citation or the type of books, but rather start with the architecture. He must know that that's going to be as crucial, right, as what it contains. Did you also want to say something to that?
I was going to say something similar to Peggy, so that's okay. Thank you.
Sure, sure, sure. So we have spot, and these are not incidental, but they are incidental too. So for instance, if 20 shelves, if he had written 22 shelves, and instead of five long shelves per side, he had written seven long shelves per side. Let me give you an example. There's an Iranian filmmaker of the 1980s and 90s, Abbas Kiarostami. Have any of you, maybe some of you have seen some of Kiarostami's films. Um, and one of the films that he has, and I can't remember the name of it, it's not Under the Olive Tree. It's anyway, basically, this is what the trick is there. There was an earthquake that happened in a particular province in Iran, and he goes and films interviews with the people who were affected by the earthquake. And there's this scene where there's this poor guy, young guy, he's like 22 years old, maybe. He's rebuilding his house. I mean, just the room, he's not even rebuilding, he's just picking through rubble and splintered wood and particles and all of that. And Kiarostami, you hear his voice behind the camera. He says, "Are you there? What are you doing?" He says, "I'm rebuilding the house that was destroyed by the earthquake. I'm just starting out." And he says, "Oh, you were affected by the earthquake?" He says, "Yeah, I just got married last week." And he said, "It's a terrible start." And he says, "Oh, that's too bad." He says, "So did you lose any family members?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "22 of my family members died." And Kiarostami says, "Okay." He says, "Good to know." He said, and then he leaves, and that's the film. And you watch the film, and you feel terrible, you feel empathy, you feel sympathy, whatever. 2 years later, he releases another film about the same event, where he shows the behind-the-scenes footage of the interview before the interview with the guy. And it's the first time he meets him the day before what you had seen 2 years earlier. So it wasn't their first encounter. And he goes up to him and he says, "So what are you doing?" He says, "I'm rebuilding my house. It got destroyed by the earthquake." And Kiarostami says, "Oh, that's too bad." And he goes, "Yeah, I got married 2 weeks ago." And Kiarostami goes, "Okay, did any of your family members die?" And he says, "Yeah, 27 of them died." And Kiarostami then says, "I'm going to come back tomorrow and film you. And I want you to say that you were married 1 week ago and that 22 members of your family died." He changes these little details, trivial details, which neither make the story better or worse, right? 27, 22, 1 week, 2 weeks. But he did that to really rupture the pathetic and parasitic gaze of, I hate to say it, but French cinema goers and European cinema goers at festivals who thought they were getting access to a real place, kind of, in their increasingly alienated, technological conformist societal worlds. They were almost voyeuristically wanting to slum it in the so-called third worlds to get a dose of like, these are real people who go through real things. And he wanted to destroy that delusion by showing that they could be tricksters, that they're not bound to authenticity or to reporting you follow to the Western viewer or whatever. So he just messed with details that neither exaggerated or intensified or did anything to the actual events, but he played with it. Well, Borges realizes something too. It doesn't matter if he says 22 or 20 or 18, but it does matter that he picks a number, a specificity, because that gives a tonal effect to what he's doing. It gives a sense of intricacy and ingenuity and almost something diabolical because you suspect as the reader that 18 couldn't just be random. Someone chose 18 or 22. This is how ritual works as well. 7 times around the stone, the sacred stone. Could have been 12, could have been 14, could have been 2. Doesn't matter what number you choose, just matters that you choose a number. So this is a similar sort of effect. So let's go back. Okay. We usually infer from this mirror that the library is not infinite. If it really were, why this ta ta ta? I prefer to dream that its polished surfaces represent and promise the infinite. This is a brilliant idea here, by the way. that it's not the infinite, but it's a promise of the infinite. Light is provided by some spherical fruit. Okay. Like all men of the library, I've traveled in my youth. I've wandered in search of a book, perhaps the catalogue of catalogues. Now that my eyes can hardly decipher what I write, and by the way, Borges, for those of you who don't know, did go blind. Famously, he gradually started losing his sight, and it was the most tragic and terrifying thing for a great reader that he wasn't able to read anymore or to see his precious library. Um, and we started this class. I rarely talk about politics because of my sheer contempt for political universes, my real hatred for what the political has done across history and across bodies over time. But Borges is, by the way, I'm not going to dance around this or evade this. Borges is often held accountable for complicity with a totalitarian regime of his time, meaning that there was an expectation that the great literary genius, the great iconic writer Borges, would speak out against the authoritarian regime of Argentina during his time that were imprisoning many writers and many artists. And he did not sufficiently critique them. And the interesting thing there is it's not the same failure of, let's say, Heidegger, who signed his name to the Nazi Party, or to other, writers who joined up with fascism or with Stalinism. Sartre even endorsed Stalinism. There's a lot of that throughout history. This was different. Borges didn't want to lose his position as the head librarian of the library. That's all he cared about. It wasn't a political decision. It was selfish, you might say, and unethical. But he was willing to let a nation fall for the sake of his library. So it is an interesting question. I'm not saying you should, support that or not support that, but it is an interesting riddle, of someone who found something infinitesimally precious in a detail and was willing to sacrifice the totality, even his own society, just to protect his library. Again, it's not necessarily a great move, but it's an interesting one. Okay, so perhaps the catalog. Now that my eyes can hardly decipher what I write, I'm preparing to die just a few leagues from the hexagon in which I was born. Once I am dead, there will be no lack of pious hands to throw me over the railing. My grave will be the fathomless air. My body will sink endlessly and decay and dissolve in the wind generated by the fall, which is infinite. I say that the library is unending. The idealists argue that the hexagonal rooms are a necessary form of absolute space, or at least of our intuition of space. They reason that a triangular or pentagonal room is inconceivable. The mystics claim that their ecstasy reveals to them a circular chamber containing a great circular book, whose spine is continuous and which follows the complete circle of the walls. But their testimony is suspect, their words obscure. The cyclical book is God. So this is an interesting thing for us to get into. Let me stop sharing for a moment. What details? Oh, hold on. What details have arisen in your mind thus far in Boris's description? Anything that you find intriguing?
I don't know, like it seems like this circular book, it can't really be opened because it cannot be read, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
It can be followed, or it can be traced or trailed, but not fully read. Good. Begum, do you want to go ahead, please?
Yeah, sorry, my place got noisy, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. From my from what I read so far, and throughout the text as well, Boris talks about these two types of infinities. One of these kind of like experiential infinity, like you experience the library as infinite, and hexagonal is like the architecture that is as I thought. And there is like this infinity, which is like this absolute, like the concept is more defined as and what we understand by infinity. Originally, it's like the infinity of God, and it is endless. But the library is not like that, which is why it is scary, because you cannot quite find a rule to it. Like, it's not a divine, or perhaps it's a work of the divine, but it may not be as well if it is not real infinite. And there are like lots of nonsense. So this is the scary. You cannot finish it, but you know that it is possible to finish it. This scares it the most.
This is a great idea. So what you just highlighted, Begum, that I would love for all of us to focus on is that, let's say there are two realities of this infinity zone. One is a highly material, sensory, and experiential reality where, Nietzsche said, I don't care anymore if thoughts are good or evil or right or wrong. I only care, can they walk? Even better, can they dance? Right? And Nietzsche is not just some goofy poet, like, yeah, what does it mean, thoughts dance? Deleuze will take this up entirely in his nomadology, right? What happens when you walk with a thought, when you make it, when you embody it, when you incarnate it, when you manifest it as a kind of execution or sort of experiential register. Michel Serres also has a book called The Five Senses, which I would recommend to everyone. Phenomenal book where he looks at the five senses and he looks at what happens to knowing or thought when you transmit sort of abstract imagination or ideas through any of the five senses, right? So there is this dimension that is sensory, material, visceral, physical, embodied, where you walk through an actual library. And then there is this abstract computational level, right? That exists kind of as a pure mind zone or a pure idea zone that's happening. And the interesting thing that Borges is suggesting here, and this is what I want to say, is that don't necessarily assume that they are the same, that they're mirror images or translations. Don't even assume that they're compatible, right? I mean, we can understand this at the most micro level of human psychology. There are things you want that you know you shouldn't want. This is Aristotelian even. The mind conflicts with the body. There are things you desire that the mind is disgusted by the thought of. That's called attraction repulsion ratio in psychoanalysis. Like, why do you look at a car wreck or a car accident on the highway, right? The mind rejects it, but there's some alternative level of desire or curiosity or fascination that who knows where that's located. It's also mind, actually, which is why, by the way, I don't have a huge problem with a couple of, I mentioned my dear friend earlier. We always joke about this, that, they call themselves a rationalist. Their concept of rationality includes every madness that I have ever heard of. So it's okay then. It's semantics at that point. If their concept of reason or rationality also includes really weird forms of thought and illogic and unreason, then it's okay by me if they want to call it that. I don't use the term, but that's okay. But my point is, what if they fall into conflict? What if the computational abstract idea level of the library actually starts running against and counteracting, conflicting with the embodied experience of it? That's interesting, that friction for us to consider. And that's what, Megan, when you were talking about that, it got me thinking of it. But at any rate, Farzad, do you want to go ahead, please?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, first of all, thanks, Jason. That was really brilliant. And also, I probably a little bit like following on what Begum has said, and you also like I much agree with what Begum has kind of like opened or described. But I also, I mean, you guys can tell me if I'm like kind of like derailing or take it to a slightly different trajectory, which I think is also fine
Mhm.
without conversation. But like, because I first read this specific work of Borges when I was like much younger and much more obsessed with the order of a spatial placement of a library, it's like where you entered as in like a pantheon of knowledge, an orderly or nichely curated, order of books and texts that you have to go there, and that's the absolute redemption or whatever you need to just go there, stay silent. And it's kind of a interesting practice and to be in a library, whether it's a
Mhm.
public library or is it one of those like not to tell anyone libraries, sort of thing that you've been to one time, which is very like cool to be, I guess. But anyway, I think when Borges takes it to an absolute and it's like I can decay or like I can like I don't know be as one with the library. I think yeah, I don't really understand this part now because I'm much more mm, try to pay more attention to the actual labor of
Mhm.
reading and not only reading the text, but also like defining yourself within the knowledge or the experience that is transcended to you through a text, through a book, through an experience. So I think in that regard, it's a bit romantic and nothing wrong
Mhm.
with being romantic,
Sure, sure.
you know, as a starting point, but I don't really see it very practical at this day and age. But it also like fine. But I think what I try to like present or and reframe my thoughts in a question is like, will it be still valid or not valid or like important for us in this day and age to consider that architectural placement and order of a library
Mhm. Mhm.
as a place that you go to, and that's the absolute. Or we can find alternative ways of, making yourself familiar with those knowledge or whatever that
Right. Right.
a library offers you. And also, sorry, I just have to let the
Yeah.
dog in. Sorry.
No, 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 no problem. I want to mention a few things there. First of all, if where Borges deviates from what you might do or how you might imagine things, this is your opportunity then to, of course, create your own, in the next 3 weeks that resolves precisely those insufficiencies or whatever. Borges is giving his version of the story, but it's not an exhaustive one. So anyone can sort of come up with that. But the thing that I want to say a couple of very fast things, Fazil. First of all, the idea that it's not nonsense. It's not a sort of a pantheon of nonsense. It's too much order in a way. There is a tipping point where concepts can reverse into their opposite at their extreme limit. This is why we say I'm in a love-hate relationship, even at the dumbest levels of social performativity, we can encapsulate that, right? We can see how love can become or adoration can become jealousy in a relationship. We can see how adoration can, I don't want to get into this, but affection can become violence even, or possessiveness, right? Of even a protective mother or father who become overprotective or tyrannical. This is the Jungian archetype of even how a good king becomes a bad king, when power corrupts them, and I don't know if there's ever was like an actual good king, but it's a fantasy, archetypal fantasy. But nevertheless, there is some weird borderland that taken too far, a virtue becomes a vice. By the way, it can go the other way around. A vice can become a virtue. That's why I always say that if you look at our apocalyptic cinema, the people we're choosing to save the world in the future, whether it's Blade Runner or it's Children of Men, is always some loner, antisocial, down and out loser sort of figure who hates everybody, is misanthropic. And we're assuming that's the person we have to bank on because they're their contempt actually becomes an immunization against ideology. They're the one figure in the city who doesn't believe in the city. And that's how they can find an escape or a cure for us. So there is something to that. But I was going to say, so if anything, just like the way that Deleuze and Guattari think about schizophrenia, too much order, too many rows, too many sequences, too many books, too much knowledge actually leads to madness, to the derangement of mind. But something else, when you said, um, or sort of what is the significance? I do have a certain romanticism that I'll admit to as well. I think that in our age, where ideology saturates almost every media channel, as well as consumptive choice, sort of at our disposal, I think more than ever, it is almost painfully impossible, but absolutely essential to see if we can carve out spaces of forgetting. Can you detach? Can you disconnect? Can you sort of disentangle from the system? Not with any revolutionary delusion of grandeur, like to find freedom in the absolute sense. Can you spare even just a half an hour at night when no one's looking to not be enslaved to the spider web of social, political, economic realities? The library allows that, right? Or at least attempts to simulate that. Whether it achieves it or not, that is important to me. Rather than thinking of it as the absolute center, I like to think of it as the exception to the rule, the state of exception, right? I see this with certain musicians. So there's a great instrumentalist from Iran named Sohrab Purnazeri. Some of you may know him. He plays kind of what the equivalent of a Persian cello. He also plays the tar and sitar, which are ancient instruments that precede the guitar. And in the midst of all of the travesties that are happening in his homeland, when he plays, it just seems like he dissolves into sound. Like he buys himself a split second of amnesty. And again, it's not a romantic transcendence, it's just a break. It's just a little break of amnesia, of willed amnesia. And you have to be damned good and powerful to weave that spell on your own consciousness to forget all of the other things that are happening around you in your immediate reality, which are also, by the way, constructed and phantasmatic and fabricated. Again, those societies are not realer than his music. They've just cemented themselves, you know, and things. So that's what I do think is the importance of it, is that if for a split second you can, the weird thing for me is that your smartphones are portable libraries at this point, but they are libraries designed to get you more into the system rather than out of it, unless you train your algorithm correctly. You can actually train your algorithm not to give you the things that it has studied that you already want, but to surprise you and to teach you acquired tastes for things that you don't anticipate or expect. That is one way of actually doing it, saying, introduce me to new cuisines, new fashion senses, new places to travel, and make sure that it's places that you know I would not have chosen myself. You can actually tell your ChatGPT to do that, and it will do it for you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care about whether or not you're free or not. It just wants you engaged. So at any rate, Sarah, please go ahead. You've been waiting for a while.
Excuse me. I was thinking a couple of things. One of the things was related to what you were talking about the relationship between the kind of the concept of the library, the logic of the library, and the physical reality. And I've read this story long ago, but reread it. It's been a while, and I had to laugh when he's describing the chambers, and he says,
Mhm.
there are two adjoining tiny compartments, one for sleeping upright and one for satisfaction of physical needs, right? And I thought, is that where they keep the women? Because when he talks about being born in a chamber, it's strangely jarring. And to imagine having been born, or how did the librarians come into being, and where do they eat? This chamber for the satisfaction of physical needs feels like
Mhm.
this void, like there's an emptiness there in the chamber for satisfaction of physical needs. It sounds like a toilet in another passage, but the food is
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
mentioned. How a librarian is born is never mentioned, and that was interesting to me. The missing parts of
I
this
love I
book.
love that you mentioned. I don't want to interrupt Sarah if you have more to say, but I just want to mention that because you've just frozen us on, well, first of all, an essential logistics. We are human bodies. There are these essential sort of biological realities. You can't just read all day long. Where do they sleep? You know what I mean? Where do they eat? And that to me should not be I love the way you said it. It shouldn't be an afterthought that is detached from the knowledge game. A lot of the best conversations that I've ever had and intellectual exchanges I've had are over meals. or at dinners, even animals. This is why, Baudrillard was so brilliant, Jean Baudrillard, when he said in one of his later works, his book on America, he said, one thing that he really found disturbing about New York City was the degree of loneliness. In the most interconnected place on earth, he said it's the only place where you'll see a Wall Street banker eating their sandwich on the steps of the bank by themselves, or a cab driver eating their food on the hood of their car by themselves. And he says it almost like, God damn it, he says, even animals know that you're supposed to share your food. That it's a shared experience, that it's a communal experience of some time. And so I think that, what are the conversations that are had or the leads that one gets in those banquets that happen when they take their breaks? You know what I mean? From reading, in those conversations that occur there, or even, yeah, in the bathrooms or in the, the bed chambers where they sleep. Of course, these are places of dialogue and of, interpretation. Also, you have to have time. This is something that any writer knows, that you can't just write 24/7. You also have to sit with it for a while. There have to be sort of periods they're not unproductive. They're precisely, incubation chambers that are part of the process. You need to get away. You need to go out and Nietzsche took a walk every day for hours. And he did his best thinking while taking those walks, but he wasn't physically writing. He wrote before or after, right? Not that he's the patron saint of all writing, but I'm just saying it's part of the sort of productive matrix of things. So there's that. But then it got something that you mentioned, Sarah, that I also wanted to bring up. The fact that he says he's born there in the library. Now, this is intriguing because I've met people. I've met actually Iranians who were born in prison. Their parents were political prisoners and they were born in prison. That is a very, and I've even met two who grew up in prison, which is really devastating. Um, but this is an interesting thing of, imagine being born into the library. So the library isn't a place that you found at the outer edges of society, but it actually is your beginning point. That is a really, that goes into, Sarah, that would go into the genre of children who were raised on desert islands or in jungles by themselves, kind of that fantasy that authors have tempted, like what would happen, if a kid lived on a deserted island, and they're raised by wolves. There you go, exactly. So that's a perfect way of thinking of it. And the last thing, and this binds, Sarah, what you were saying to what Farzad was saying, that I would just bring up. There's also another option. We haven't spoken of whether or not you're supposed to also write something in this library, right? The sort of the active, the next active dimension, whether you're supposed to leave a single text on the shelves or whether there's something that's supposed to be produced. Notice that Borges quite brilliantly, he warns us almost that the bad psychology of human is that we will first look at this infinity, and unlike a child who will let it remain a mess and likes the mess, we will try to say there must be one book that is the book of all books, right? So we create a God, sort of in a sense, or a center. With this beautiful, anarchic, decentralized universe, suddenly becomes a search for the perfect, ideal, absolute book, which Borges is very slyly warning us against by telling us this is a bad move, right? But the second bad move that you get to the end, at the end, he says there's even legends of a man of the book, pardon the patriarchy, right? But actually, it is patriarchal. Religion has always been, it's a religious theological principle. A man of the book, the librarian who found the book of all books. And now we have to go in search of him. Do you follow? And Boris is just shaking his head like, I wish we were all 7 years old because they wouldn't make these bad moves, right? They wouldn't have to create these classifications, vertical classifications of what's a horizontal and unbound space. So they're going to ruin it. And this is my fear, by the way, of all revolutions, that people ruin revolutions in the end. They have a chance to suspend things in a much more liberating form. And then there's going to be a call for the leader or the ism that will define, what should be a beautiful combustion, sort of borders and of limits. But that also is happening here. So the interesting thing of also what you would write in this is going to be a cool question. Sarah, did you have anything else you wanted to say then? Go ahead, please.
Oh, I won't take too long, but I wanted to trouble this idea of the infinite also because I think he's talking about faith, right? He's talking about faith and the belief or the hunger for a belief in the infinite because it can't be infinite, right? If there's 23 characters and two punctuation marks, then there is a numerical limit to the number of combinations that
Right,
exist. It's not an infinity. He's sure and he wants it to be an infinity, but it's not an infinity.
right.
And that's interesting. He undermines his own infinite, the infinite library
That's
in
a
his
great point.
expression.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. It reminds me of something I mentioned last seminar. I thought there's a beautiful space called Solomon's Prison in northern Iran, which is a volcanic crater. And the local people there are like, have always spoken of it as a bottomless crater. But you can see the bottom when you're standing at the top. You can literally, it's deep as hell. I mean, it's super deep. It looks like an underworld almost, but you can see the stones on the bottom, and it doesn't deter them from calling it bottomless. And so that's an interesting question here. That you're right. The numbers are excessive. They are, but they're not innumerable. They're not. But he keeps using the terminology fathomless, boundless. Um, I don't necessarily think it's logically incorrect, but I think it actually there's a trick to what he's up to there. And actually there's some place where in the footnotes to the text it says that he uses this is a great moment. He uses 14 somewhere in the text, and the translator translated it as infinite. And he says, when Borges says 14, it might as well mean the same thing as infinite. That's the translator's really audacious, courageous, slippage that they're doing there. But that's how they interpret it. So they translate infinite. So there is a point where 14 becomes the infinite, I guess, but whatever that means. Anyway, awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Jordan, please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really been thinking about in reading this text and throughout the presentation as a whole is kind of the very slippy like fundamental of the library is it's a collection of books, but what in fact constitutes a book. And like this is something that I think a lot about with my like art friends that work
Mhm.
in book arts. Like I have a very dear friend that looks at Adrian Piper's What Will Become of Me, which is the artwork that is just a collection of the artist's fingernail clippings and hair, like as they cut them throughout their life. And, my friend is very strongly of the belief that that is a book and one of the best books
Mhm.
in a way because it encapsulates something that cannot otherwise be captured in a cohesive form. And like when I was just going through um like the Library of Babel right now, like out of curiosity searched for the word read, and the word read, like the action of reading a book, does not occur in the text
Mhm.
until you're three-quarters of the way through it.
Mhm.
So in some ways, like there's an interesting act of collecting that
Yes.
does not is not determined by its consumption then. And although like Borges does describe a book very literally, like of there are this many pages, this many lines per page, um, like that act of designating what each book on the shelves looks like could really in my view be completely disregarded, and then like the shelves instead become collections of other types of books, objects that contain stories in and of themselves. Like the page numbers seems totally arbitrary, and almost like one of the like the library itself is a collection of could be anything other than what we consider in this day and age books.
So Jordan, this is brilliant because one of the tricks that the Enlightenment played on us in terms of knowledge, we all know that the Enlightenment created the academic distinctions which haunt us to this day of creating disciplines that don't intersect with one another. So mutually exclusive. So psychologists are in their own incestuous kind of realm of knowledge. They don't talk to sociologists. Sociologists don't talk to engineers. Engineers don't talk to design and architecture people. And everybody gets fractally kind of isolated in their own feedback loops, sort of without cross contamination, which was the essence of. I don't want to romanticize this, but we all know the Renaissance paradigm of knowledge, where figures like Da Vinci were mathematicians and doctors and painters and poets and all of them at the same time. There's many things problematic about that era of knowledge as well, but it's something that definitely the academy institutionalized a kind of a weakening, sort of rule by dividing, kind of methodology there, whereby everyone just sort of is in their own hyper specialized zone. So this is interesting because when you talk about textuality, could an object be a text, right? Could a is a painting a text? Is it not communicative? Is it not a form of narrative? And we even get in awful debates. This is something that I really despise about what's happened with the devolution of philosophy as a discipline. Not only, I mean, philosophy was always tragically a white male, sort of white man's club and Western white men. And by the way, not even all the West. Like if you were from Portugal, no chance of getting included. It was Greece, and by the way, the version of Greece that they want, right? With their highlighted figures, Socrates as the origin of all knowledge. It's like, what about 1,000 years earlier? You have philosophers who nobody's read about. But then you go all the way from Socrates to Germany and Hegel, and then the French are tolerated as kind of a 20th century decorative. But that's it. And then England gets thrown in there, and some Americans have some wisdom, they think. But outside of that, I mean, Eastern Europe completely shunned, the Mediterranean, other Mediterranean culture completely shunned from that and all of that. Um, Not to mention, and then forget all the other regions, East Asia, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, indigenous peoples. Those are totally lost in the game. And women writers and writers of other, alternative, just all that lost. But this got really bad when then even philosophy's sort of supremacist, patriarchal pantheon started arguing about which white men are even philosophers. So that's the analytic continental divide, where now you get like, well, Nietzsche's not a philosopher, Foucault's not a philosopher, Derrida's not a philosopher, Heidegger's not really a philosopher. It's like, well, who's left on your sinking ship, of rats? Like you're basically excluding everyone to the point of it's just going to be you and Kant sitting on a boat, in the middle of the ocean eventually, and that becomes and some British dudes that they like. But this becomes a chance then with this library to for collusion and for all of that, but in a not just intertextual way, but then bringing in objects, bringing in image, bringing in this, and not as supplements, but as narratological forms in their own right. And by the way, that's not futuristic only, even though we're becoming that way. Notice we're going back to pictorial culture, emojis becoming sort of communicative. This is not simply futuristic, it's also ancient. Look at the hieroglyphs. Look at cave paintings, and it's not that the hieroglyphs and cave paintings are not supplements to text. They are the texts, and so it's not thinking just, oh, it's nice to have a picture to go along with the writing. They are the writing, as well. So they're definitely there. And even body, you're absolutely right, Jordan. Body can also be a form of inscription. We look at tattoos. You look at the history of cosmetology and all of that. You know, a lot of people don't know cosmetics is something that even the Bible talks about as something that the watcher angels gave as a divine power to humans who they felt bad for. So that's an amazing gesture if you think about that. But then they got something, one last thing you mentioned. We talked about fingernail and hair clippings and things like that, Jordan. You know, there is a Holocaust poet named Miklos Radnoti. Some of you may know the name. And Radnoti died with his poetry in a notebook in his pocket. And he died on a march, on a forced march, where he was executed. He was shot at the end, thrown in a mass grave. And when the bodies were exhumed, they found his poetry. Well, I've seen the actual notebook in a museum, and it has his blood on it. You know, I mean, it literally has his blood and it has the dirt of the mass grave, into the page. They're tarnished. He's got the folds that come from this exhausting march that he was on before he was murdered. And it contains his last words. So there is something staggering about seeing a book that actually carries the physical remnants and traces of its author as well. And I also have mentioned this before. There are great poets I know from the Middle East who have written in blood, literally written in blood, on prison walls. And that's not a fabricated or exaggerated statement. It's just the police agencies don't give you pens and paper in dungeons. So if you want to write, you got to find a liquid, and that becomes the most ready form of ink that you have available. So definitely, this is a great question then of of what's there. There's also, by the way, just to say quickly, something that is lost in the digital age where you all have Kindles or we read PDF versions of books and all that is the wear and tear on texts, which actually are essential to forming. This I have to be very careful of because as a philosopher, no one knows or cares and all that. But I've always kind of been opposed to memory because I dislike memory's ability to get trapped in nostalgia, in sort of in all sorts of, and also identity, the way that memory becomes a very sentimental gateway into identity rather than being transformative. But there are brilliant orchestrations of memory. There are radical orchestrations of memory. Even Proust has really interesting experiments with involuntary memory. And, even recently I was talking about that there's a really rare form of storytelling where you have all these memories and then you terrifyingly realize there's someone else's memories in your head, right? It's a cool twist in the storytelling. So, but the reason I brought that up is that um, why did I bring that up? There was something to do with that. I wouldn't want uh, the library to be a memorial necessarily, right? We have enough, that's monument culture then, right? Which is supposed to do that to that gesture. And what I dislike about monument culture is actually that they completely it creates a disaffection. People don't look at statues in parks. People definitely don't read the plaques, except maybe a tourist, will read. But people who walk through a park every day don't read the plaques of the statues because it's almost there to do the job for them vicariously. It's like, okay, whoever that is, who built the park, I'm glad there's something written on the ground for them. Now I don't have to learn about them. And so it actually pacifies bodies in a certain way. So it's interesting to think about, can there be traces or can there be forms of, oh, what I was going to say with the wear and tear of a text, when I any book in my library, and I have, it's the one thing that I collect above all other things are books, obviously. And so among tens of thousands of books, I can remember most of them in terms of where I read them. And part of what gets me that are the notes that are written in the margins, but also the wear and tear of the book, the broken spine, the folded pages. And I'll be like, that's right. I was in Portugal, or I was in Morocco, or I was in Dubai when I read that book. And it brings back all kinds of associations that way. And that gets lost when we create these seamless digital sort of versions of that. We lose the place, sort of time and place of something. Um, it's a trade-off. In some ways that's good, in some ways that's bad. But at any rate, I'll stop talking. India, please go ahead.
So I don't know if I'm gonna derail the discussion that is really
No.
great. But I wanted to talk about the part of the story that most caught my attention every time that I read. That
Mhm.
is this old-time tea pyramids. That
Mm.
there's this theory of being about this Shakespeare sonnet, and I would love to hear you talk about it, what you think about this old-time tea pyramids in the text.
Where is it located? Can we go to it? Do you know where it is in
This
the? Let me see if
I
I
have on PDF, so
let me see if I go to if you tell me which page of
let me find here.
the PDF, then I can. Where was it?
I also don't have it open.
Hold on 1 second here. I don't know why I also
Page
don't.
I think it's a
53.
book. It's a book that only has one sentence, and it's the only sentence is like you can understand, but they don't know what about is it is that old time tea pyramids.
It's on page 53. I
Oh,
also
53.
thank you.
marked it. And
Thank
it
you.
reappears at the very end, or like something quite similar.
Perfect. And let me go to it real quick then here. Where was it? 53. Do you want could you read it to us? The part you're looking at?
Um, so it begins with second. The orthographical symbols are 25 in number. This finding made it possible 300 years ago to formulate a general theory of the library and solve satisfactorily the problem which no conjecture has deciphered. The formless and chaotic nature of almost all the books. One which my father saw in a hexagon on Circuit 1594 is made up was made up of the letters MCV, perversely repeated from the first line to the last. Another, very much consolated in this area, is a mere labyrinth of letters, but the next to last page says, "O time, thy pyramids."
Hmm.
And it goes on.
Nice, nice, nice. So this is there's a lot to that. One of the things that when he says a general theory, he refers to chaos and then he refers to the search for a general theory, which physics, as you guys may know, is the discipline that's been consumed with a search for a general theory, right? General theory of the universe, whether it's relativity, whether it's string theory, whether it's, sort of other types of theories that have emerged. And the question that they don't often ask is what is the consequence or implication of if even if you found one, what would happen at that point? Some might say that Freud's unconscious is a search for a general theory, right? Sort of an all-encompassing universal archetypal structure of mind and of being. And the reason he chooses psyche is that psyche is supposed to house all the dimensions of experience. It is supposed to be mind, emotion, mood, impulse, drive, desire, right? At every level. It's a search for a general theory, and there can be something very, very, it's a slippery slope. It's a very perilous gesture. But because what it requires then, and this is the thing, is that this notion of cumulative knowledge. He mentions his father, right? And that he's now we have a sense that there's a legacy, that he's working off the back of his father's efforts as well, right? And that therefore you must be getting closer, right? And this is a by the way, this is an interesting question, even in the history of philosophy. Is it absolutely necessarily true or sure or certain that I don't know, that a thinker in 2025 or 2026 now must be better than Plato because they've read Plato and Plato's been around for 2,500 years? You follow, like, are we on a progressive arc where the thinkers of today must be more enlightened, must be more radical, must be more complex, must be more whatever, because it's a cumulative process. So whatever is today also encompasses Plato, plus everything that came after Plato. You follow? So we're standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm not so necessarily sure that that is the case at all. In fact, I'm convinced it's not. I'm convinced that we are not living in the greatest era of literature, by the way. I'm absolutely convinced of that in my own preference, by my own stylistic and taste definitions. Oh my God, uh, I would trade our era in a heartbeat for 100 years ago, right? Even 60 years ago, 50 years ago. I think was superior in storytelling and all that. So there, and by the way, that's even for technology. Even, pardon me for saying the name, but even Elon Musk has made an interesting point that technology doesn't always move forward. And he points to, please don't, let's not get into conspiracy theory talk about this. He talks about the moon landing. And he says, look at the fact that we haven't been able to reproduce a moon landing since the 1960s or whatever. And it's because we neglected that technology in certain ways. And so technology can go backwards in certain spheres and all that. So it's the same with ideas. It's not a backwards forwards. It's just that I'm not so sure that Heraclitus is more primitive. Do you follow? A thinker than some cool theorist who's writing today. Not in the least. Um, so then that becomes an interesting question of what does it mean to work in the shadow of your father and to use your father's notes, do you follow, as to carry you forward in your other thing. The assumption must be is I must be getting closer. This is what I want to disabuse, the delusion that I must be getting closer to the center of absolute knowledge because of everything that's come before me. By the way, again, I don't want to get political, but this is a Marxist view of revolutionary history as well. That when he says this extremely dangerous comment that the final revolution, the successful revolution, will redeem all past failed revolutions, that is a retroactive narrative gesture to say, then all their deaths will be worth it, will justify it. The final revolution will justify all the bloodbaths of failed revolutions that came before, because we have to read all those failed revolutions as stepping stones that got us to the final universal revolution. And that is a massive assumption, right? That is a massive assumption because it's also based on the logic, the mythic logic of what is necessary. Who had to die to get here? And there's no way for us to compute that. There is no way for us to know in the bizarre topography of causalities that ricochet and are based on weird things that, oh, we had to have every single death in a prison or a gulag or a concentration camp in history or in a street or in a mass grave. All of them were necessary to get to the final universal revolution. It may be the case that half of them were necessary, one millionth of them were necessary, meaning in terms of actual realization. You follow? So this becomes, I mean, this is when even Antonin Artaud, because if we want to go by that logic, you can see how cruelly fascist it can become. Artaud, at one point, he was getting the great schizophrenic French writer, but thankfully he had no power. He was getting his face shaved at a barber shop, and he put his hand up in the air and he said, I've seen this everywhere. He goes, at least 2 or 3 million people, or no, he said at least half the population of the world needs to disappear. Like just whimsically, he dreams like that they're not necessary. Now, what his hierarchy is or what his criterion is of disappearance, is it random? Is it judgment? He doesn't go on to describe there. But that's where that leads to, right? The thinking that everything is necessary is also everything is expendable. Do you follow? For the sake of the final goal, everything can be sacrificed. This is the problem of 20th century utopianism that kills human beings in the name of humanity. Always, that's the slippery paradoxical logic. We have to kill all these people to save humanity. So we have to be careful here with the books too, right? Because, by the way, this is where judgment as a philosophical concept becomes such a problem. moving towards the absolute book, the true book, the one book, eventually that person in that mindset could justify the burning of all the other books, right? So my Iranians in the room, Farzad and others, you know of maybe Furugh Farrokhzad, for me, one of the greatest poets ever to walk the earth, great woman poet from Iran. She had a lover, Ibrahim Golestan was his name, who was very tyrannical and opinionated. And after her young death, she was in a tragic car accident at like 30, in her early 30s, flew through a windshield of her car. And she had all this body of remaining poems that had not been published. And he decided to burn the ones and throw away the ones that he thought were not good enough. So what remains of her body of work are the poems that he selected, right? That to me is a vicious logic, an absolutely vicious logic. And that's one of the problems of when you go in search of the absolute perfect book or you think you're getting closer, it means you can start to discard, dismiss, and even destroy all the other forms of knowledge, which is a microcosmic explanation of how history has worked and the history of knowledge and of ideas throughout time, right? Who doesn't get their place at the table? But the idea of the cumulative, the last thing I would say to this, India and Aga, is that there's a great mathematician who became a drunken poet in Persian history, Omar Khayyam. And Omar Khayyam is single-handedly responsible for a lot of algebra and things like that, sort of brilliant mathematician. But then he decided to become a drunken poet for the last 30 years of his life. And the reason was because he came to a point where he realized, this is amazing to me, that the more mathematical knowledge he discovered, the farther from universal truth he became. Not even that it wasn't leading anywhere. It was like a warding off mechanism, a shield of the universe. He kept thinking he was getting somewhere. And just like someone in a labyrinth, what happens in a labyrinth is you think, oh, I should walk to get out of here. And you start to move. And the more you walk, the deeper lost you become in the labyrinth. Well, similarly, he realized he was getting more bewildered, more perplexed, and farther from the goal of absolute knowledge, the more he discovered in mathematics. So he chose the opposite, drunkenness. And weirdly enough, he thinks that that got him closer to being able to whisper the language of the universe. It's only in his drunken states at night that he thinks he can talk with the world or talk with the universe and learn certain secrets from it. So it's a fascinating idea here. The move that his father's books, he also doesn't seem to question whether his father's math is wrong, right? Whether his father made mistakes. This is like the implicit bias that police officers and detectives have to face when they get on a crime scene and some witness says, yeah, I saw a red-headed woman run that way. And so now they're looking for a red-headed woman, and that's going to make them not look for all the other possible prototypes that are involved. But at any rate, who else wants to say anything, and then we could move on.
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in the previous discussion, I think with Sarah, you kind of like Sarah, I think argued like if like this library is possible, like would it support human life or like how do they manage? And similarly, I kind of questioned whether like in this library could anybody write anything, like could they ever gain like this literary consciousness, could they kind of apprehend what a book is, because if like what we know of books is like first of all we first learn like writing or reading, and then we learn that there are like these libraries, and then that there are like lots of books which are like selected either social historically or like personally, etc. Like there's like this process of like choosing which books to keep, and then we add to our social consciousness as well, and through that we kind of evolve like how we express ourselves via language, and then we are able to also choose which words to use where, and like the meanings, etc. But if there are like lots of books, and the person that talks in this writing also says that like, books are formless, they are like nonsensical, they are like these, that they are not epistemological apparatuses, they are actually opposite. Like they see these books as chaotic, whereas what we see books are like these really ordered things where we learn stuff. Like they are categorized in themselves. They have like indexes and stuff. Like it's easier to find something than to come across it in the streets in books. But for them it's the opposite. So how could like somebody could write anything? Like how could they not be? How could they gain consciousness as we understand consciousness? Is a question. So I thought that maybe, and which would like approve the existence of library, that this is in fact is not written by anyone, but is actually one of the books in the library itself, with the false quotes and with like lots of these different details that make no sense. It is one of the books in the library, and the library exists, but we don't know its relation to any human being. It is somewhere out there perhaps, because this book exists, like this paper exists that claims that there is this library, but it can be like not hexagonal. We still don't know anything about this book, this library, but we are informed via this fictional text, which is kind of crossing the fiction non-fiction, because like it might be approving of the existence of library too. I don't know. Like this was my kind of hypothesis regarding this.
I love this. Let me just say this to that. First of all, so literary criticism in the past 40 or 30 or 40 years has become really interested in a concept called the unreliable narrator, right? So these are narrators like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who smoked a lot of opium, and he wrote this great, poem called Xanadu, and all of that. But it's an opium trip. Okay, already the drug makes it an unreliable poem. But then there's other things that, I mean, Rimbaud starts off, Rimbaud is the young king of decadence. He's the absolute brilliant poet. He starts out, if my memory serves me correctly. That's his season in hell. So before he tells you about this whole world of evil, if my memory serves me correctly, means it may not. I may be misinterpreting or misremembering things. So unreliable narratives, and even, by the way, the book that is often considered the first novel in Western literature's canon, Don Quixote by Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes, is a found object book. So Cervantes claims, of course, it's a technique, but he claims, this isn't my story. This is a story I heard from an Arab when I was a slave in North Africa for a few years. And that actually happened to him. So Miguel de Cervantes was captured on a ship. He was enslaved for a couple of years in North Africa, Morocco or Algeria, I can't remember. And he met other prisoners, and he claims that this is the story of one of them. Don Quixote is the story of them. So already you have an unreliable thing, because there's translation issues. There's, sort of all kinds, it's not his story. And so you can't ask him for the origin. It's like a vampire. Vampires don't know where vampirism came from. They're just symptoms of it, but they're not the origin of it. So interestingly, there's beyond the unreliable narrator, now you've complicated with like the idea of the unreliable librarian, right? So what if these librarians are not there to help you, but there to misguide you or to trouble you, or like you said, to maintain the chaos? And that would actually be a very Borgesian move. And I'll give you guys the equivalent. He has another story. It's one of my absolute favorites, called The Lottery in Babylon. And there he talks about this lottery system where every night we change roles in society. You can become a king or a queen. You can be a god, but you could also be a slave or a tortured prisoner. And he says, I've been all of these things. I've been worshipped one night, but I've had my third finger cut off my hand as well when I was tormented in a jail. He's like, I've been all these things. And every night we draw cards or straws, I can't remember what it is, for different destinies, and we role play different destinies. And it's a beautiful anarchic vision of a city, an anarchistic city. It's the best diagram I've ever heard. But the really amazing dark thing that he says in it is that there must be a committee of anonymous overseers to maintain the purity of the lottery. Otherwise, people will cheat, mafias will form, there will be organized. So we must have this extremely totalitarian committee that maintains the anarchy. This is the paradox of the amazing contradiction of his lottery in Babylon. And this is maybe what's happening in the library as well, that in order to maintain the chaos, we have to have this secret society of librarians, this authority complex that maintains the chaos. Do you follow? That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, about that, he talks about somewhere like this demiurge, demigod, and I was like immediately reminded of this like Descartes deceiving spirits. I think where like you cannot really trust anything, because what if somebody who is actually the creator of everything that you see or perceive, etc., that you think of, is one of the deceiving kind. So every time you're actually deceived. But in that sense, here I thought that maybe it is something like that too. Like it, but here is not the committee. What governs it is not from the same species with the narrator, but narrator maybe perhaps experienced some sort of a library, but the details, the very specific details that he gives is not quite reliable. Something exists, I'm sure of it, but like what nature, I'm not quite sure if we can get it by
Okay,
text.
good. So here's what I was saying. One of the reasons why I choose to do philosophy through literature or through art or through cinema rather than through, when I read philosophical essays, which I do all the time, there's oftentimes you're in a kind of airtight mosaic. You're sort of strangled in the moves that they themselves are making. You can't think too much often into their thoughts. The way that in literature you can. There's slippage or there's vagueness. And Borges is in particular one of the great writers of obscurity and puzzles. And what I mean by that is he leaves room for us to come up with, to fill in multiple blanks with potential narratives. So what I mean by that is, here's a question he doesn't answer. How do you become a librarian? Like we assume as the reader of the text that we would be readers in the library. That if we were there, if he does play, we're visitors who are there to read and search like he is. But how do people become librarians? Were they former readers? Right? And if so, how are you selected? Right? We already know that there are people who die and get thrown over the railing into the abyss. So there are lots of readers who don't become the librarians. But there must be certain kinds of readers who either, is it random? Is it by some accomplishment? Is it by some, interaction? What is exactly the logic that turns you into a librarian? You could come up with 50 different stories of how you become a librarian in Borges's library. But just as much, then you could come up with then what is the function of those librarians? They're just these ominous hovering shadow figures that go up and down the aisles. We're not sure, what they're doing exactly in there. And so that also leaves room for us to speculate and to create possibilities there and to decide which one we find the most intriguing option for sure. Um, and the idea that are they tampering with texts? Are they tricksters in a certain way? That definitely, or are they part of a conspiracy? A very intimate conspiracy of the library. That also is open ground for us to interpret at will. So just Faz, did you want to say something quickly, and then we can just move to the end? Go right ahead, please. No? Okay. So I was going to then, you know what? Why
Oh,
don't we?
sorry. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, as I just try to be very quick. So
Sure,
yeah,
sure. Go ahead.
I'm gonna reflect on a couple of your points that you made. First of all, regarding like enlightenment, which is a very interesting kind of like notion or a period in history to look at when it's speaking of library and orders of texts and blah blah blah. I think, well, I don't know, maybe it's just a matter of phrasing, but I think Khayyam didn't consciously choose to like let go of all his like polymathic like existence and become a drunkard. I think they all coexist, like that very like dry mathematician, well, not dry, but the mathematician, physician, the sort of like alim, as we say in like Farsi and Arabic, who's like, knows everything. And then also being a poet, because like I think it's a saying in some of the Eastern cultures in Mediterranean and Mesopotamian cultures, like too much knowledge makes you crazy or something like that, or make you silly. So that's that. And it is very interesting to look at Khayyam in terms of like Eastern and Western treatment of enlightenment and knowledge, which kind of like embodies through text. And where does the text go in a book? Where does the book go in a library? What happened to the library in East? Most often they will get burned or banned or, discarded or whatever. And in West, a few ones that are kind of like nourished or built up upon the back of the heritage and the knowledge of Islamic states or like the pre-Christian, pre-Islamic knowledge. They just came up as in like, oh, actually, this is our own discovery, which is really not. So, it's like rewriting the whole history, rewriting the orders, rewriting the hierarchy, and like stealing the moment, not stealing, or grabbing the momentum from east of the world to the west in like post-medieval world. That's one thing. The other thing, which
Could I just
yeah,
quickly
yeah,
get
yeah, sure, go ahead, go ahead.
I want to, while people have that fresh in mind. So first of all, this figure Omar Khayyam, this Persian mathematician poet that we're talking about, it's very interesting. He's also, I don't know if he's the originator of the form, but he's definitely the king of the quatrain, which is four lines, four-line stanzas that are written very short verses. And the reason there's a geopolitical reality of his time of why he does that. He lived in one of the most oppressive time periods, of medieval Persia, where you could be easily killed for writing forbidden poetry or whatever. So he wanted these to be quick whispers that people could memorize and transmit to one another and circulate in an easy fashion. So that's why you have quatrains. Now, interesting, even though he condensed and compacted them, as you must know this, that there's probably no poet of that time period in Iranian history that there's as much debate over whether or not that's actually his writing or not. So one of my favorite writers of all time, Sadegh Hedayat, who wrote The Blind Owl, has actually a scholarly book. His only scholarly book, really, is looking at Khayyam's quatrains, and he's like, I think 80% or 70% of them are not his. And he creates that this becomes part of like a Borgesian library gesture then, finding and identifying the real quatrains and what is your system? What is your interpretive, sort of matrix by which you decide, no, this poem is probably not him, right? And so that's a really interesting thing that happens there. As for the relationship between the mathematical dimension of his consciousness and the poetic, I like that you said that. It's better than what I had said, sort of he gave up one for the other. I think that you're right that they kind of formed a hybrid in a way, and the poetic and the mathematical became part of one another. But what's really interesting there then is what was I going to say that you had mentioned? Oh, there was something quickly that came to mind about it. But well, I'll get back to. Why don't you finish your thought that you were going to
Yeah,
say
okay.
about?
I have two very quick other notes, which are like continuation to what I started with. It's like sorry, I'm just like looking at my notes as well. The pre-Enlightenment scholarism in the East, whether in India, Persian world, Islamic states, China, and Japan to an extent, can we say like they are kind of like when it comes to text and in books as well, and also ultimately in form of library as a source of knowledge, they are in a sort of like I think that I always think that they have a different approach
For sure.
to the order of philosophy and enlightenment movement that started from like the ancient Greece and the Roman Empire and stuff like that, because they really tried to be selective in the West, like who can get to this pantheon, who's worthy of like knowing and not knowing based on the gender, place in society, caste and stuff like that, which kind of like applies to the East as well. But I think maybe I'm from there and I'm like a bit homesick in a
No, no, no,
historical
no.
context. But
It's absolutely true.
it
Although
is more like I think it's more like inclusive when it's in East. And also my very last one is like, which is a question, is like, do you think that if we can say Sufism, not with this like mysticism, because I strongly uh, like try to differentiate between mysticism and Sufism, as we probably know, and also Irfan as a form of knowledge, as a form of like gaining and distributing knowledge. Could we think of those things in the East as a sort of an open source library of expressions and experiences, which I think Begum or someone else has also mentioned, this sort of like alternative or replacements for book-based, text-based libraries, like living libraries. I don't know. My partner is very like going forward to study midwifery, and I think like I was Googling something about midwifery, and I found like, wow, there's so much knowledge about like bodies and stuff that aren't necessarily transformed into text in the old. And it's just like among
yeah, yeah,
those like, illuminated people, and they
absolutely.
are the truer,
So
closer to experience.
here's the again, part of the politics of knowledge is not just banning or outlawing books, but it's also reappropriating and co-opting them. So the figures, it's always a bizarre thing to me when I hear aristocrats reading the poetry of Hafez. Because Hafez he was a bum. He called himself that the Mar de Rend. Rend means like a nobody, a bum, a guy on the side of the street. He died with debts. He was always at the tavern, sort of drinking, and writing poetry. And yet now there's this
And
huge,
also,
beautiful.
sorry, just very sorry. And also, just FYI, as he admitted in his poetry, Hafiz knew the whole Quran in
Yeah, of
form of
course.
14 or 7 stories, like,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah,
14
he was a
different
great
stories. He
memorizer.
could recite the whole of Quran.
Absolutely. But then to see how this guy who in his own time was this kind of nothing figure in a way in the streets of Shiraz, he now there's one of the most beautiful architectural sites talking about architectures that it's like a pilgrimage site to go to his grave, and pay tribute. This is bizarre, but in the same way that Nietzsche, this wandering guy who went to cheap hotels in Switzerland and Italy, when unread and unpublished in his life for the most part, suddenly becomes an iconic face of fascism 50 years later. This is the really nasty thing that history can do. It's not just exclusion, it's inclusion that is part of the politics of knowledge, but inclusion in the most perverse ways, right? That are about stealing their thunder and hijacking their image and all sorts of things like that. What I wanted to mention to your point about enlightenment, and thank God you said it because that's what I was wrestling to rediscover, is that there is an Eastern concept of a non-Western concept of enlightenment as not an absolute state that you achieve, but a momentary condition that then you get exiled or flung out of again. So the problem with the concept of Western enlightenment is once you're there, you're there. Right? Once you're enlightened, you're enlightened. Right? That's a kind of Kantian and Hegelian even concept of it, and all that. That's the at least the stereotypical enlightenment that we understand is that it's a threshold that once you pass, it's like irreversible. But Khayyam, Hafiz, they speak of these moments of ecstasy or of a kind of delirious awareness that only lasts like for a flash. It's like seeing God for a split second. And then you get flung like a star that is trying to throw you to the end of the universe, where you have to start all over again in your journey, in your climb, and all of that. This is interestingly at a cinematic level. Um, Tarkovsky's film Solaris, right? Which some of you know is a planet that, as you approach it, it starts to make you demented and have hallucinations and starts to run you into madness. That's part of its protective mechanism. And so there's a concept of enlightenment as once you get too radioactively close to the truth, or to enlightenment in these forms of thinking, we're talking Khayyam, even Rumi, Hafez, that it expels you away from it. It has all kinds of shielding and defensive sort of barricades that don't let you stay there, right? And so it is an interesting concept that if you were to ever find the man of the book or the book of books in Borges's library, might be precisely instant where the librarians kick you out of the library forever. They banish you. Or the moment when they throw you over the railing, even though you haven't died yet, right? So this is an interesting notion. Or it would reset you to zero and you would have to begin all over again. Do you follow? So this is a concept of enlightenment as a split second exception, not a rule. And I know I've said his name a lot today, but I always thought of Nietzsche's overhuman this way, right? That it's not this Superman stereotype of once you get that will to power, you're just this walking superiority complex, better than everyone else. That's this kind of machismo, kind of fanaticism that goes like some of us are just alphas and this and that. No, no, no. It's quite the opposite. It's a state of extreme vulnerability whereby if you touch upon it, even slightly, it precisely catapults you back to the bottom of the mountain again, right? Nietzsche is if you read The Stillest Hour in Zarathustra, you realize every day he wakes up as all too human, and he's got to try and drag and claw and bleed to even purchase himself a moment that he could call inhuman or post-human or superhuman, right? Or extra human. And the second he gets it, he loses it again. That to me is a beautiful concept, a beautiful gesture. It's actually what happens it's why games are fun. Any game where you master it to perfection becomes boring, right? But the game where still you can surprise yourself by hitting an amazing shot. The best pool players in the world, if you ask them their favorite thing, is they'll say trick shots. Once the linear shots are just too perfect and you can hit those shots, it's just all about inventing trick shots. And so we have to think about enlightenment as a trick shot, sort of. If you guys, I know, sorry, I'm off on a tangent, but if you guys watch basketball, there's an amazing figure, absolutely exquisite, named Steph Curry, who can shoot better than anybody has ever shot a basketball in history. Steph Curry's whole delight comes in making impossible shots. And if you go and you just Google or YouTube his pre-game warm-up routines, his warm-up consists of him trying to throw the ball from the other side of the arena, and swishing it, making it, and everyone erupts and all that. That's his favorite part of the game, not his consistency, not his continuity, not his records, but bizarre shots, unfathomable shots. That's his favorite thing to try. So if we think of enlightenment that way, it makes it more playful and light and definitely more temporary, more fleeting, more transient, which I would like better. Are there any final points we didn't get to everybody? But next week you're all going to then bring your designs, and you don't have to visually manifest them. You can visually describe them. But this is a great thing. So I would just say this. We can just end on this then. Um, Architecture also can include setting. So this is it's a completely, I don't want to use the word personal or subjective. This is the fun again, the childlike kind of fun of just asking, do you want it to be in a forest? Do you want it to be in the desert? Do you want it to be in a cave system? Do you want it to be in a castle sort of zone? Do you want it, you can pick any type of zone, and that brings in climatological possibilities, that brings in topography, that brings in all kinds of geological structures, and all that, as well as the internal built architecture of the space. They also don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can have rock formations in the library. You can have trees growing from within the library. You can have seismic earthquake, sort of openings in the library. You can do whatever you want with it, essentially, but just uh, play with the idea of space as much as possible. Create its contours, and you can also think of the effects if that helps as well. then what kind of strange affects would emerge as a result of being in that space and walking through it and wandering through it. And this puts you, by the way, in a very diabolical position of the labyrinth maker, the sort of, in a way. So do your best and realize that the more manipulative you become, this is the weirdest sort of paradox I'll throw at you. The more manipulative you become, the more you're liberating the reader in a weird way. It's not a control mechanism. It's not a prison system, right? So play, and I can't wait to hear what you come up with next week. We'll gather again, and then you'll share your designs. Remember, the week after is going to be the catalog of actual books that are within it that you can devise. But everyone come ready to present next week. It was wonderful seeing all of you. Take care of yourself.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.